What's good, people? ZenSphere back again with another RENOISE tutorial. Today we're going to be exploring some techniques for creating generative music within RENOISE. Generative music is music that is ever-changing and is governed by a system. Now this can run the spectrum from almost purely random sound to very specific sounds, sequence of sounds that are operating under certain constraints, but nevertheless have some variability. So there are a number of techniques and ways that we can create variability within RENOISE, some degree of randomness. And we'll explore a few of those today, starting from kind of the more simple towards the more complex. One simple way of adding some variability or randomness for generative sound creation is through our modulation section. So here I've just loaded up a simple single cycle waveform, a sine wave with some harmonics. And we'll go into our modulation tab. And we have a couple different ways of introducing randomness to our parameters that are available to us. The most straightforward way is with an LFO. Using this sample and hold waveform, you can see that there's a kind of randomness to it. And if we bring our frequency slider all the way down, it will hold a value, even though it looks like it's dancing around. It will hold a value for the duration of a key press. But on the next key press, it'll have a different value. So we can use this, let's take it off of here, and apply it to any of our modulation destinations. We can apply it to panning, to volume. So it may not actually sound that interesting in this particular instance, but you get the idea. We could maybe change this and so that's one way of introducing some degree of randomness or variability in our modulation section for all these modulatable parameters. And another way that I'm just going to delete this modulation set and add a new one. Another device that we have available to us that can function in this way is the stepper device. Now the stepper device cycles through a series of values with each key press. And by default, its step length is set to 1. So each time you press it, it goes to the next one. But you can hold it still or have it skip, which can create some interesting kind of pseudo-random patterns, depending on how you interface the step length with the length of the pattern. And you can hear that we have a class of pitches. It's not random like the random LFO is in terms of the output value. So that can be nice if you want to constrain it to a class of values, whether it be pitch or volume or filter automation or what have you. But if we cycle that back down below 0, we actually have access to this random step. So this has all kinds of applications. Say we wanted to trigger a note at varying octaves. We could set this to, say, 3, and right-click and process create linear curve. And so then we have -1, 0, and 1. And since our pitch range is set to an octave, it's going to randomly trigger a note at a given octave. We can kind of alter the weighting of these probabilities. I'm just going to open up the external editor by adding some more steps and setting values to 0. So in this instance, we have a 1 in 5 chance of being down an octave, a 1 in 5 chance of being at the origin octave, and a 3 in 5 chance of being up an octave. And you can hear that reflected. So say you wanted to weight the probabilities differently towards the center octave, and you mostly just wanted it to play that center octave, you could shift these zeros over, right? So this plays the origin octave, down an octave, origin, origin, origin. Basically, it repeats the last value until it finds a new value, even if it hasn't triggered this value yet. I hope that makes sense. So you can change the length of your steps, I believe up to maybe 256. So even if you wanted to do like a percentage, you could say change this length to 100, and then, you know, have whatever values you want, and have everything else be 0, and just set up the proportions accordingly. So say you wanted to have, you know, that percentage of down an octave and that percentage up an octave, and maybe, you know, 1 little chance or 2 little chances of a couple different values. You could do it like so. So it's almost always going to be one of these 3, but then occasionally we have an outlier. So you can, you know, do the math and set up your probabilities that way with the pitch stepper. It's kind of handy. And of course, you can apply this to volume, panning, pitch, and these 3 filter parameters as well. So that's one way of doing some generative variability within your instruments. Let's take a look at another way using a sample here. Oh, we got to close out of our external editor. So I'll go over to my waveform view, and I have just a kind of a simple riser sound here. You can hear it. So this technique works well with sounds that have some variability within them already. I'm just going to trim this down because I don't think we really need that tail, and maybe trim down some of the beginning as well. And what I'm going to do is we can do this manually via the slice tool, just setting slices however often we want, but I'm going to actually use a tool called the chop sample tool. And we'll just chop this into 16 pieces. And I like to destructively render the slices once I've chopped them, because that will allow us to normalize each one. So these quiet ones we can make louder by normalizing them. I'm actually going to delete this first one because that has all of the sound data. And I'm just going to normalize these. And you can do this manually by hitting Command P and scrolling down with your mouse wheel. You can do it like that. Or if you have the batch process tool, you can just batch process them. So now we can see these are all normalized. So they should have kind of comparable volume levels. So as we go through our different keys, we can hear the different sounds. But the way we're going to organize this particular instrument is going to our key zones tab. We're going to go ahead and hit layer. And this plays all of them simultaneously, which is not what we want, but we're going somewhere with this. There's this overlap mode here. And right now it's selected as play all, which is not, again, what we're after. But we have another two options here. We have cycle and we have random. Cycle steps through each sample one at a time, and then random cycles randomly. And each one can have its own kind of benefit depending on what you're trying to achieve. For this instrument, we'll choose random. So now when we press a key, it just cycles through randomly. So going to our phrase tab, let's create a phrase to re-trigger. And now when we press a key, we can hear the samples being selected randomly in accordance to the phrase. And we still haven't really touched our modulation section, so we can use that to sculpt the sound further. Let's do more like this. And we can add another stepper in here and get some more random variability. You can see it dancing around there. And let's add some variability in the panning. Now the nice thing about this kind of layered random key zone selection is that we can access different pitches just by pressing different keys. You can see I'm on octave 5 here, octave 6. So you can have very different timbral characteristics across the keyboard. Now you can do, whatever you want with this. We're not really looking at the sound design. We're just kind of looking at the principle of how you can create these kind of random instruments. Now, in the phrases here, we could add some more variability by setting up some maybe commands. The Y command stands for maybe. Maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't. That's variability. That's a degree of randomness. That's very useful in generative constructions here. So I'm going to go ahead and just input a bunch of Y values. I'm going to delete this first one because I want that first note to trigger no matter what. And then we'll just use a probability of 75% for each of those. These are hex values. So 0 would be 0, 40 is 25%, 80 is 50%, C0 is 75%, and FF is 100%. But you don't even need to use FF. You can just delete the maybe command if you want something to trigger most definitely. So now, we not only have variability in the sample that's selected, but we have some rhythmic variability as well. And you can change these probabilities to weight it however you want. You can obviously change the note events and create whatever kind of rhythmic phrase you would like. You can have multiple note columns triggering if you want different pitch classes. The sky's kind of the limit as far as this is concerned. Say, for instance, we had done this with a breakbeat instead of this riser. We could have kind of evolving probabilistic rhythmic textures, just kind of generating ad infinitum. So hopefully you get the idea. There's a lot that you can do with this. So speaking of phrases, let's look at some more applications of the use of phrases for generative music. I'm just going to bring in, let's see, I'll bring in just a white noise sample. Oops, I meant to actually do that on a new instrument. And I'm going to trim this down. and fade it out and take the loop mode off, just so we have a little pulse of sound, something sort of like a hi-hat, little burst of white noise. And we'll go into our phrase tab and create a phrase. And once again, we'll just create a really simple phrase, and I want it to be on C4 because that's our root note. And this is about as simple as you can get. But what I'm going to do now is go down here, and you can right click and do duplicate, or you can do the Command D key command to duplicate this phrase. And I duplicated it a number of times. And what we're going to do is we're going to change the lines per beat. And actually, I want this one. Let's make this one 4. And we'll make this one 8. And we'll keep this one 16. We'll make this one 32. And we'll make this one 64. So now we have this little tick kind of occurring at different time scales. Now, notice we didn't put in any probabilistic commands here. You certainly could. Again, you can do whatever you want with the phrases. They're super, super flexible. But I'm just kind of demonstrating an idea here whereby you can create an effects chain. And we're going to bring in a doofer. And I'm going to open up my phrase control doofer, which I will post on my Gumroad. The phrase control doofer, it's very simple. It just has a Hydra tied to an instrument macros device. And the Hydra is tied to the phrase program number. Now, you do have to kind of alter these min and max values to correspond to your phrases if you don't want a lot of kind of dead zone in your macro knob. So 0 is off. We want to always trigger a phrase. So we're going to set minimum to 1. And then we have 5 phrases, so we'll set this down to 5. I think that should do it. Let's just check with the knob. Yep. So we've got the full range here. You can see as I turn the knob, we're selecting different phrases. Now, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on what you're trying to do, the phrase will not shift in the middle of a key press. That meaning you press the key, it's going to stay that phrase even as you turn the knob. And you need a new key press to trigger the new phrase. So that can be good or bad depending on what you're trying to do. But in this case, let's just set a note event. Let's do C4. Every 16 lines. And I'm going to open my macros, and I'm going to set this to my phrases. Now, you have a playable So you could record automation on this macro if you wanted to. This isn't exactly generative, but it's just a useful technique that I wanted to show you. So as we're looking at generative techniques, we're going to go ahead and mute this track. And we'll open up this track and create some more note columns. And what we're going to do now is switch from program mode to key map mode. And we'll drag and drop. Let's go C4. Each phrase onto its own note. And I'm just going to use the white keys just for kind of simplicity's sake here. You could do it on whatever keys you want. And if you want to set up transposition, You can leave these bigger, but I just want one note because it's just a simple rhythmic phrase. And, oops, that's not what I meant to do. Forgot you got to drag and drop. Okay. So now what we're going to do, let's open up one more note column here, is we are going to record each phrase in its own note column. Okay. And then we'll set a Y0 command at the end. And this is telling it to trigger just one of these. So we need to enter some Y commands in our volume or panning column. And since this is just a single digit, let's just use 4 across the board, which means that each one has more or less a 25% probability of triggering, but only one of them will be triggered. So the program figures out the math. It's not a problem that we have 5 25%. That's not an issue. One thing you do want to do is set an off note message before your next key press. Otherwise, your most kind of densely populated phrase will kind of take over. It'll just keep running and you won't be able to hear the less densely populated phrases. So I copied that whole structure and I'm just pasting it. So now if I did this correctly, what we should have is every beat is going to be triggering a new phrase. And as you can hear, it's ever changing, somewhat random, but we can weight those probabilities, those Y values in our volume column if we want, say a certain phrase to trigger more often than another one. You can just increase the Y value. So very much a generative technique. And of course, these phrases can be filled with whatever you want. You could have entire, chopped break beats or vocal samples. The sky's the limit. It just depends on how you set up your instruments and how you set up your phrases. So that's what I have for you today. Well, actually, there's one more thing I wanted to show you. Back to this first example. We'll mute this. And we'll play this again, and let's see. We need to go back to here and change this back to program. What we can do is we have our phrase control set up, and now we can, it's tied to our macro again. Now what we can do is let's put a key tracker in here and an LFO. And we'll have the key tracker reset the LFO. And since we're going to be using a sample and hold waveform, we don't have to bother with our destination min-max. It's going to be random, so it doesn't really matter. Frequency down to infinite lines per cycle. That's going to kind of freeze the LFO with each key press here. And then we'll tie this to instrument macros and phrase number. Now, when we press play, we should have a randomly selected phrase number. Again, this will just continue to generate for as long as you play. The upsides of this method is that it's a little simpler visually. You don't have to program in these, multi-note column phrase patterns. And the downside is that you don't have probabilistic control. So it's more or less purely random from the random LFO. Now there might be a way to set up a custom waveform in the external editor with points and using this kind of like a stepper, but I haven't tested that out and I'm not sure if the behavior is the same. So you might be able to get kind of a probabilistic weighting using this method. But again, I haven't tested that. I've just used the random LFO. In any case, I hope this has been useful and instructive for you and inspiring for making some generative music. Again, you can apply this to melodic content, you can apply it to rhythmic content, you can apply it to timbral content. It's really only limited by your own imagination and creativity. All right, that's what I got for you today. Go out there, make lots of music. We'll catch you next time. Peace.